You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Cameron Lalana.
And I am the Matt Gerasimovich.
And today we are covering Part 1, Chapter 2 of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. We have a lot of comments that people shared today, so I'm excited to chat about the thoughts that people had about us getting into the camps. Not excited about the camps. Let me make that clear. That's the official podcast stance here.
I'm gonna blow on past that right into the comments, which, like you said, we had a lot today, and I was very bad at accumulating them into our shared document here. I was mostly nodding along in agreement, broadly speaking, with everybody. So I wanted to start by talking about the quote that you included in our post that went out this morning on National Socialism and the language specifically of it, because I think that's a really important point that Grossman emphasizes here and will continue to emphasize, because I think that when we look back at World War II and we look at some of these terrible atrocities that are committed in the Holocaust, and we tend to think that, well, I wouldn't have done that. And it's really easy with hindsight to look back and say that was bad. But what he is kind of pointing to, and this is, I think, why the book continues to transcend time and why we continue to read it nowadays, is that it really is, it kind of acts as this sort of warning in a lot of ways, where he talks about how easy it is actually to fall into doing really bad things. Not necessarily bad people, how good people do bad things, or just how normal people do really bad things, and how it can be compartmentalized and whatnot. And in this quote, he says that National Socialism, it seems at home in the camps because it's not peering down at the common people through this sort of monocle. He says it talks and it jokes in their own language. It's down to earth and plebeian. It has an excellent knowledge of the mind, language, and soul of those it deprived of freedom. And that, to me, is one of the most profound points of this, really of the whole book, actually, but especially of this chapter.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's something that one of our users pointed out to us. This one comes from Leah, and I'll be adjusting this quote a little bit since part of it is the exact same quote that you just read to us. Mostovsky's observation about National Socialism being of the common people and animated by them is chillingly relevant, I think. These camps are essentially controlled cities in miniature, animated by that populist spirit of National Socialism. I don't necessarily think what Grossman describes in The Hell of Treblinka as, quote, wolves in human skin is how this dynamic ultimately comes about. I think it's easy for people to fall into these roles when there's a suggestion of communal bonding, because as Mostovsky observes, and getting to that quote that you mentioned, and then I think we see things like this all the time. Leah says, I think I heard you all mention Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem in a recent episode. I'm interested to hear what people think about the whole concept of banality of evil as it concerns the self-policing element. And as you responded to Leah in the Discord, that's something that Grossman's going to be kind of engaging with later on here. So that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, we have another 200 pages or so, I think, at least to go. There's somewhere in here, there's one passage which is a really direct response. I don't know if he had read the essay before writing this book. I need to check on my chronology. We'll talk about it in one of our main sort of numbered primary episodes on the book, because I want to go back and kind of dig into that a little bit more. But there is what is, if he did not read it, he may as well have, because there is a literal direct response to some of those passages in this book. But It is a really important thing to flag now, because that's really what the book is concerned with. Yeah. And quite frankly, if you're not at least as a person a little concerned with it, then, I don't know, maybe pay attention a little bit more closely, because we probably should all be concerned a little bit with this question.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And moving on from there's another point that we saw a couple people address, which is that in this chapter, Grossman is talking about the new types of criminals created by National Socialism. And some people really caught on to the phrasing of National Socialism as opposed to Nazism or fascism. And so we had user Sally said, is there any significance to the way Grossman used the words National Socialism as opposed to Nazism or fascism? And another user, Natty Boy, also on Discord, there's a repetition of the innovations of National Socialism. And I'm wondering if this repetition is Grossman playing on how a Soviet reader would think about socialism in the USSR. like the USSR's brand of socialism is sold as being innovative and life-altering, and here Grossman is giving us his inverse, or what could be seen as a darker side to it. And I think this kind of question is something that we're seeing from more than one readers. There's a couple other readers who mentioned some comments in here that are along the similar things, who are already taking this point where we're talking about the prison camps of the Nazi prison camps and starting to make comparisons to the USSR, which I think will be a stronger element later on. I don't know if it's more a suggestion here, and I think us as readers knowing where this book is going to go is going to kind of inform that. So I think that's one thing you said to address that the question that we talked a little bit about the using National Socialism in the server, but I mean, I think without doing any research, gut instinct is that it's not necessarily as loaded as a term as using it now, in a sense, where someone is often using it to like kind of emphasize like the National Socialism to draw comparisons to the USSR. But Grossman doesn't need that to draw comparisons to the USSR. He's doing it in much different and frankly, much more sophisticated ways.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to avoid that topic a little bit in just the sense that I don't want to fall into this sort of reductive horseshoe theory. Oh, they're basically the same thing, because I don't think that's the point that he's getting at. I think he really masterfully looks at the overlaps and kind of what it's like to be under an authoritarian government. But I don't know that I'm 100% convinced that he's, saying they're the same thing, essentially. There are a lot of comparisons and points of comparison, but I think that, I don't know. I got to read through it again on this one before I really get into it, but I'm kind of hesitant.
I think that kind of goes along with our usual discussion of talking about so-called dissident writers, whereas all dissident writers become like, oh, you're anti-government, whereas the reality is I think you could call Grossman a dissident writer, but you could also call Solzhenitsyn a dissident writer, and certainly those two people are not dissident writers in the same way in any meaningful context. Frankly,
I don't think Grossman's he's not a dissident writer, really.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe you could call him. I mean, maybe you could make this argument, but I don't think that really he falls into that same camp, which is why I like him more than somebody like Solzhenitsyn. That's just on like a personal level of taste. Sure. I find these people who are really, really enthralled with what they're doing, who fall away from it, more convincing than somebody who has always been hardened and against this idea from the get-go,
Yeah, definitely.
That's just me personally.
No, I get where you're coming from, and I think that's something to talk about, because I'm going to bring two more lines in here. This one's from Mike Shaw, who is also on Instagram as Books to Pug.
There's our number one pug follower.
I think and kind of talking about the camp and the ways, the attitudes that the prisoners have, which is very international here, right? I think the giveaway of that is that the sense of freedom and true communist spirit we see is happening in exile outside of Soviet territory. These could have been singing these songs in Moscow, but Grossman's placing it, in this camp instead. Following on the same thing, I'm also going to read one from Emma here. People have already touched on this, but the way Grossman writes about industrialization makes me think about how the work camps are kind of the horrifying logical conclusion to the nationally planned industrial economy. So on one side, you have Grossman having, at least at one point, buying into the basic premise of the USSR as a socialistic project. And then on the other side, you have the stark vision of what pure collectivization can look like when people come completely subsumed under the broader economic superstructure. That's something that more than one person tracked, is this sort of regularization of life, planned geometry. And of course, in the novel, this is being drawn specifically to the fascist forces, to how German ideology overlays the landscape. But as we mentioned, there are already people who are starting to make connections that I think the book will have more so later on, where we start to see comparisons, more explicit comparisons between German camps and the Soviet gulag. Although I think as Matt said earlier, I think we have to kind of be careful around how we read those comparisons, because I think pro and anti are a little bit too simple. And especially, if you read Grossman's work, he reserves much greater depth of hatred for the Nazi forces. And I think he's critical, and he will be. You'll be reading this of the Soviet system later in life. Yeah, he'll go way more into it, especially in Everything Flows. But here you still have to remember that we're still not that far off of World War II. We're years onward now, but we're also like, this is not like a sudden harsh change. This is a slow process of years of Grossman meeting people returning from the camps, of like as Matt said, someone who is deeply ingrained in the system, slowly moving away. So I think a pure one-to-one comparison might be a little too strong to make here, but for sure, people who are reading this are definitely tracking these comparisons that are going to be made.
Yeah, and I think as we move towards the next chapter tomorrow, or I guess by the time you hear this episode, it'll be today, perhaps. Chapter 3 here. We'll start to see a little bit of how this kind of diverges, at least from my point of view. I think we'll start to get into more and more why this is or was kind of revolutionary as it was being written and what it's kind of reacting against and what remains important for us to look at today. But yeah, I do agree that I don't believe in this one-to-one comparison completely. And we'll see. Maybe I'll convince you, maybe I won't.
Well,
it's okay. It's not the end of the world.
well, if you don't agree, Matt will come out and find you.
Well, I mean, that's a given.
I mean, maybe we should have put that in the front of the tin, but sometimes you get on Mr. Bones' Wild Ride and you find out the terms and conditions along the way. But
yeah, I don't know what everybody thought when I've been saying you'll hear from me again soon.
You'll hear from me again soon, roughly around 12:30 a.m. tonight. Anyway, thank you all for being here today, and you'll hear from us again tomorrow.
So